right. So I don't know if everyone here knows me, but well, for the people who don't, my name is Ian Runkle. I run a YouTube channel, Runkle of the Bailey. I also really enjoy fighting the government because that's kind of where things are. So how I got...
I need your help because I'm fighting the RCP and CFOs.
Well, let's one fight at a time. But I really got started on all of this, and my wife is here. She can back up some of this. So in law school, there is the giant aspect of so much work and so much stress, and I was like, I need a hobby. And I remembered I'd enjoyed shooting with my dad, and I thought, I'm going to get back into that. And then because I was a law student, I went, I need to make sure I don't run afoul of the laws here. How hard can they be? I'll spend a couple of, an afternoon or two just getting myself up to speed. And then afternoon or two turned into months, and I went through the wonderful phase of, I don't understand this because none of this makes any sense. And later I realized that I understand it just fine, and in order to understand it, you have to get to the point of realizing that our laws make no sense. And at that point I was hooked, and I realized that there were tons of people out there who are navigating the firearms rules and trying to figure it out and trying to survive in this world. And I went, this is what I want to do, and I've never regretted that. So we're keeping on pushing forward. And right now we are in, as people know, very difficult times for firearm owners. And everyone here, I'm sure, is either affected by some of the recent changes or friends are. And if you're looking at the recent changes and saying, I'm not affected, you may not have read them closely enough, or you're next. And for all the people who've always said, hey, I don't need to worry, these aren't my kinds of guns, look to Australia. Once they finish off with, the current rounds, they'll come back for lever actions, they'll come back for, and eventually they'll be saying, well, this kind of break action can be reloaded too fast. Look at this guy, Jerry Michalek can reload a break action or reload a revolver however fast. We got to ban these two. So what I'm here to talk about today is some of the pushback that we're seeing, because there are some heartening moments here. And one of the elements of that is the pushback from provinces with respect to the federal gun bans. So I want to talk about the Alberta Firearms Act and the Saskatchewan Firearms Act, which were put in place as responses to this and are intended to make life difficult for the federal government, which I approve of. So what do these bills aim to do? Well, thank you. So the first thing that they try to do is by limiting what they call seizure agents by requiring a license. And we'll get into what a seizure agent is going to be, but the broad category is people working with the government as part of a buyback program. So especially people like gunsmiths and gun stores that are running a buyback, that's who this is really aimed at. And this is critical to the government's plans for this because they don't have the manpower and they don't want to spend the money for all of this. What they really want to do is to leverage the existing gun owner or gun stores and gunsmiths in order to create this network of people who already have the skills, already have the training. Because I can tell you that if they need to start training our CMP officers in how to deal with this, it's going to be a very rough time for them. They don't want to do that. They want as much as possible to be able to sort of subcontract this. So Alberta leaves seizure agent largely undefined in the legislation, which isn't really a great thing because there may be a bunch of litigation later as to what is and is not a seizure agent. Saskatchewan does have a definition, which is fairly broad, but it does exclude the CFO, firearms agents or firearms officers, and the police. So Saskatchewan has basically, by doing so, said, hey, listen, if you want to fund this entirely on your own through the police, fair enough. But if you want to start, leveraging the sort of the gunsmiths and so forth, now you are going to have to, now you have to go through our rules. And that's probably in part just to avoid some constitutional issues, but I think it's also in part Saskatchewan saying, hey, federal government, you can pay your own way on this one. So, because the provinces don't want to end up holding the bag. A lot of provinces have realized that this whole project is probably going to end up with them holding huge costs that they never get back. So we'll start out by talking about Alberta's law because it is shorter. And it's got a few things that I think are worth pointing out. The first is that they've got actually a section of responsibilities for the Chief Firearms Officer. And Saskatchewan's Act does not have this, but it includes, and this is a section E, shall engage in advocacy for and outreach to Alberta's firearms community. Crazy, huh? A CFO who's actually there to support the firearms community? I mean, we're sort of used to the CFO being the leash, and this is saying, hey, the CFO's job includes supporting lawful gun owners. Crazy idea, but they put it into law. I love that. It also requires seizure agents to be licensed and has some big fines for if they're not. $20,000 for an individual, $100,000 for a corporation, or 3 times the amount that they earned by operating as an unlicensed seizure agent, which means whatever the government offers to pay them, Alberta proposes to triple it in fines. So they can't be outbid. It allows for huge regulation of how licensees are supposed to act, but those regulations don't exist yet. And it also restricts the municipalities and police forces from taking federal funding for gun confiscation. The minister's got to approve. Now, that's great so long as the minister remains friendly. If Alberta gets an NDP government, things may look a lot worse on that. And everything is left up to future regulations, which currently don't exist, which means that right now it's impossible to get such a license because there's no regulations saying how you'd get a license. But we don't know what the eventual shape of those rules will be. So that's basically Alberta in a nutshell. Now, we can look at Saskatchewan, and I said Alberta's rules were shorter. They're about 3 or 4 pages. Saskatchewan's rules are 32 pages. So a lot more detail, a lot more defined. Saskatchewan's Firearms Act also does a few things that Alberta's doesn't. And the first is it creates a separate idea of a Saskatchewan firearms license. And so in order to have guns in Saskatchewan, you now need to have the federal PAL and the Saskatchewan firearms license. The good news is that absent something else, you are deemed to have a Saskatchewan firearms license if you've got a PAL. So you're not going to have to do any extra paperwork and apply for anything. You've just got that covered right now, today, if you're in Saskatchewan. However, the law does allow for separate suspensions of the Saskatchewan firearms license, which means that theoretically you could have a federal PAL and a suspended Saskatchewan firearms license. And there's provisions for how that happens, which is if you commit, say, attempted murder or various other firearms offenses, they will automatically suspend your firearms license. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. But the other thing that they do that's unique to the Saskatchewan rules is they incorporate a ton of the firearms criminal code offenses. Those are now also duplicated in the Provincial code, which has some interesting impacts to it. So the main impact is that it allows for Saskatchewan to decide how they want to proceed in charges. So let's say you're a resident of Saskatchewan and they want to ding you for careless storage. Well, they can do that under the federal criminal code, which is unpleasant because let me tell you, if you end up with even a minor criminal code violation that has the word firearm in it on your record, a lot of countries will look at you very suspiciously if you want to, say, go on a vacation. They'll say, oh, you have gun convictions? Well, you don't get to come in here. Because, of course, other countries can decide whether or not you're allowed to visit for any reason that they feel like. So, instead, they have the option to proceed under the Saskatchewan rules and hit you with a fine and something that doesn't go on your criminal record, which, let me tell you, is a big help if you want to be employed in future, travel, etc. It creates that flexibility. We don't know yet whether they're going to use it, but it creates options. And I can tell you, lots of lawyers will come to me and say, listen, I've got a client, he's done this firearm thing. Is there something he can plead to that isn't a criminal code offense? And normally that requires a fair bit of creativity. In Saskatchewan, it's going to be a lot easier. So that'll be a big deal. Now, let's talk about seizure agents. As mentioned, it doesn't include the RCMP, so the government can pay their own way. But if they are going to be using these other people, first it requires a license, and licenses they can set fees for. We don't know what those fees will be, but I have a feeling Saskatchewan's going to put that number upwards, because what we see in this bill is not that they want to really make life easier for these seizure agents. In fact, we're going to see the opposite. They've got to have liability insurance. So if they take your guns and damage them and they were supposed to give them back, they have to have insurance to make sure that they can pay for that, which is important. They also need to have training. And the first section of training is in safe storage, which is not going to be a big impact because we're talking about gunsmiths and gun stores. They almost certainly already have that training. They're also required to get training in crisis intervention and de-escalation techniques. And I can tell you, none of the gun stores, what's that?
And then go to Ottawa.
None of the gun stores currently have those, have that training. And so that's going to be an additional process that they have to go through. And I also think that's a good policy, because if they're going to be sending people to collect things at people's doors, it's good that they be able to, talk things down without things turning into a bigger issue. They have transport rules that are over and above what is required by the federal law, and it requires various things, including tamper-evident locks, and one entry that is really hilarious. They have a limit on how many firearms they can transport in a vehicle at once. Now, I want you to think of the last time you went to the range, and just put this into perspective, because the limit is 3. 3 guns at a time. So, and it's got to be a windowless vehicle, it's got to have a locking box, so these gunsmiths are probably not going to be able to throw these things in their pickup, and they're going to have to invest in special procedures for all of this. We're really narrowing the field of how many gun stores and gunsmiths are going to be like, I want to sign on to this. All of this ends up putting more costs on the federal government if they want to have these people on board. Storage rules, big long list of safety procedures and so forth, but also humidity controls to make sure that your guns don't rust away while they're sitting in a safe, because they have provisions to appeal that say that they might have to give your guns back, so they have to take good care of them. They're also required to have 24-hour supervision by a licensed seizure agent. So remember that licensing process. They're not able to hire out to Garda or whoever else for this. They're going to have their own people there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to watch wherever they're doing their storage, which gets expensive, especially considering that they also have limits on where this storage can be. And this limitation, if you've looked at sex offender registry stuff, they're borrowing from that, because they're not allowed to store things within 1,000 meters of any of the following. 1, a single or multifamily residential home or facility, including the home quarter section of a farm. So if you're looking around on London, Ontario, all of it is out. Next is a daycare, school, college, or university. A place of worship. Those are all over the place. A theater, arena, concert hall, or similar facility for entertainment events. A similar list for sporting events. A restaurant, and you might think that that's a silly thing to include. Why would they put in restaurants? Well, the one place in a city that you might be able to find a 1,000 meter circle that doesn't include a residential home is industrial areas. And what do industrial areas have? They have small restaurants, because those small restaurants, people got to eat, right? Warehouse workers go to eat, and so you get these little sandwich shops and so forth. Each of those little sandwich shops sets up 1,000 meters in every direction that you can't run one of these in. Hospital or medical clinic, grocery store, shopping center, pharmacy, including these little tiny things, or other similar location regularly attended by the public for the purchase of groceries. So that Handy Mart across the corner is probably also setting up 1,000 meter radius, or would be if it was in Saskatchewan. clothing, household goods, or similar items. So we're talking it's going to be real hard to put a storage facility anywhere. And the same rules apply for anywhere where they want to conduct destruction or deactivation. So good luck, and they're going to have to put this out in the middle of nowhere with somebody there staffing it 24 hours a day. And when I say somebody staffing it 24 hours a day, keep in mind seizure agents are also subject to a rule that they are not permitted to work alone. So they're going to have a buddy. Two somebodies, so that they can talk to each other, you know.
Those people living on site now have a residence in the seizure facility.
I assume that they aren't going to be living there, just hanging out overnight. But the other thing is when we think about they're having to make these trips at least 1,000 meters, but it's probably going to be way further than that, to pick up 3 guns at a time to take back to their facility in their specially modified truck with 2 people each time. How much is it going to cost to pick up your gun collection? Because, you know, a friend of mine has over 100 M1 Garands. He collects them. 3 at a time. That's, you know, with 2 people each time, that's going to be expensive. Oh, and they need a different 2 people at the destruction facility or at the storage facility because they can't leave them alone. So the next provision, the person who conducts the seizure must pay fair market value, which is going to make it also real difficult for the federal government because they would love to set compensation levels that are way low. And we're going to see part of that. I don't really want to sort of do a call out here, but we're looking at the CSAAA, who is working to sort of establish values for retailers, and those values will be at like retailer prices. What are the retailers actually out? Which is of course, you know, wholesale prices, which is not what I paid for my guns. I paid retail, not wholesale. But what we're going to see, and this is a prediction, but I'm rarely wrong on these predictions, is the government is going to come back with those numbers and say, these are industry approved numbers. This is what you're getting for your guns. So they're going to want to pay us wholesale for guns we paid retail for. Well, this says that no, they've got to pay fair market value. And that's on the seizure agent to pay. So if the government says we're going to pay $1,000 for your $4,000 gun, then that seizure agent is potentially out that $3,000 because that's on him to make that payment. Who wants to be a seizure agent having heard all of this? I'm not seeing a lot of hands.
Can I ask a question that?
Yeah.
So this gives me hope, what I'm hearing, but how does the jurisdiction between the federal government and the province work? Is there any?
We'll get to some of the discussion on that because there is some division of powers issues and there's going to be fights. So fair market value, also interesting, covers a whole bunch of things, including the make, model, and caliber of the firearm, age and condition, firearms ammunition, any accessories that accompany the firearm, which is important because the federal government very much wants to pretend that accessories don't exist. They're saying, oh yeah, well we took your AR-15, the AR-15 is worth whatever, but who cares what scope, what optics, you know, all of that is on you, and you know, you're going to put your 3-gun setup on, oh right, we're not allowing any guns suitable for 3-gun. So here they'd have to pay for any accessories. Rarity and any other special features or similar factors that would enhance the value and collectability. So if you've made modifications, possibly including even things like, hey, I milled this out to accept a red dot, so now it's worth more. Any previous determination and various other things. So that is going to make this more of a process because now they have to evaluate each individual firearm for its value. This creates a bureaucratic headache for anybody involved in this, keeping in mind that while all of this is being sorted out, they have to store it with 2 people on site at all times in this place out in the middle of nowhere that they have probably just had to rent or buy specifically for this. Every firearm also has to be forensically tested for criminal history. So they're going to have to do ballistic testing, they're going to have to do various other things, and the police have to sign off that they don't want the gun for each gun. When we're talking about those bureaucratic hassles, we have now added additional things, especially because Where is this forensic testing going to happen? I can tell you probably not at their storage facility. That's probably going to happen at some facility set up by Ottawa, etc. And, oh right, they're going to be able to drive in there 3 at a time.
Somebody really put some thought into this.
Oh, I sort of going through all of this, prepping for this, I was like, wow. And they put some effort into this. At some points, I was just like, this is some brilliant trolling, but it's well written, it's well done. Municipalities and police boards need approval for funding, same as the Alberta rules. So, how can they do this is the first question. People often are like, hey, isn't all of this under the federal powers? Well, criminal law is federal. Under the Constitution, there's sort of this big parceling out of who gets which powers. And ultimately, we have the firearms reference that decided that firearms fall into a weird category, where some aspects of it can be regulated under provincial powers, but other aspects are, can be regulated as criminal law. I hate that case, but we're stuck with it. That's the Supreme Court for us. But property and civil rights is provincial. Provincial gets to decide how businesses within the province do business. And so if they want to say, if you want to operate a business of taking guns from people, here are the rules, they get to do it. So this is going to be a very interesting fight, and I think it's one that the federal government may well lose on lots of critical issues. So this means it's a very good time to live in Saskatchewan, so long as the Saskatchewan government remains friendly to gun owners, which, elections happen, so we don't know. But what does this do? It limits the availability of seizure agents. As I said, lots of people are going to be, sort of cynically, there are a lot of gunsmiths and gun stores that have been going and sort of considering dabbling with this, because if your business was entirely doing gunsmithing for people's ARs, well, your business has evaporated. It's gone away. And so there's a lot of people with mortgages, with, whatever else going, well, I still need to pay the bills. I still need to feed my kids. I still need, unfortunately, the government has put us all in the position of having to make some tough decisions, and they're included. I've got some sympathy for people in this situation. But I think a lot fewer people are going to have their hands up if these are the rules. It ramps up the cost dramatically for the federal government, because the federal government is going to be doing everything that they can to try to keep those costs down, especially by doing things like going, oh yeah, well, we found that you could, way back when, get an AR for this price, therefore all ARs are the same price. So, it doesn't matter that you've got a, whatever, the first serial number of a Colt AR, they're going to say, well, we're going to price that out like it's an Norinco. So, and not just that, but like a Norinco that we got off, Canadian Gun Nuts that was going because like, oh, it's like new. I only backed over it with my truck a couple of times, barrel slightly bent, fires 1 time out of 3, that kind of thing. And it ensures compensation. If you're in Saskatchewan, this helps mean that even if you do end up having your firearms seized, that they're saying you've got to pay actual market price, which is going to be huge for a lot of people because a lot of people are feeling the sting here. And if you're a collector, some of those collectors are sitting on, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property that the government would love to price out at basically nothing. And I'll get to you in just a moment there. I'm just sort of wrapping up on this. But basically, I think this is fundamentally an excellent thing, and I hope we see more provinces picking this up. I'd love to see Alberta import a lot of the Saskatchewan rules. I want to see more of this. In provinces where we're not seeing this, we are still seeing some pushback. We're seeing a lot of provinces say, okay, you want to start seizing things, we're not putting up our own money. And if the federal government doesn't start saying, hey, we're going to promise money to those provinces, which they might, we may start seeing other provinces put in similar rules to sort of put the government's feet to the fire. So just wanted to sort of give you guys a rundown on all of that and sort of what we're looking at.